Hi, good morning everyone. My story this morning is about Esther the brave queen. You can read this story in the Bible in the book of Esther. This is a true story of a girl, an orphan girl. Hadassah was an orphan girl. She sat alone on the doorstep of her empty house. Because there were tears in her eyes, she couldn't see the blue sky, the green grass, and the yellow flowers. Hadassah is very lonely because she had no father and mother. Mordecai, Hadassah's cousin, came to her house. "Come, Hadassah," he said. "Come and live at my home." Hadassah gathered up her clothes and tied them into bundles. She was pleased to be going with cousin Mordecai to live with his family in the town of Shushan. Mordecai and Hadassah walked along the dusty road. Hadassah's sandals made small footprints in the dust. Mordecai's sandals made very large footprints. Now Hadassah could see the blue of the sky, the green of the grass, and the yellow gold flowers, because no longer were there tears in her eyes. Mordecai worked for the king of Persia. Every day he sat at the gate of the king's palace and answered the questions of the people who came asking for help. Hadassah sometimes carried lunch to Mordecai as he sat at the king's gate. "Here is your lunch, cousin Mordecai, pomegranates and cheese and bread with honey." Hadassah grew up to be a very beautiful girl. She was such a happy, helpful girl. "No longer shall your name be Hadassah, it shall be Esther, which means a star." Esther liked her new name. She kept on saying, "Esther, Esther, Esther," over and over. She said her new name. Now it happened that the king of Persia was planning to choose a queen. "Gather together all of the most beautiful maidens in the land," said the king to his helpers, "that I may choose a queen from among them." Esther was one of the maidens called up to the palace. Mordecai watched them as they came through the gates. He thought there was none so beautiful as Esther. Then after maidens was presented to the king, all of them were beautiful. But when the king saw Esther, the shining star, he said, "Esther shall be my queen." With his own hand, he placed a crown on Esther's head, a golden crown with pearls. Queen Esther went to live in the queen's house, in the palace garden of the king. From her window, she could see cousin Mordecai as he sat at the king's gate. Esther read the king's list of palace rules. There was one very strict rule. It said that no one must go in before the king unless invited. If anyone did go in without being invited, that person would be put to death unless the king held out the golden scepter. A terrible thing happened in the land of Persia. A law was passed that on a certain day all of God's people would be killed. Mordecai sent a messenger to Queen Esther telling her, "You must go in before the king and ask that God's people be saved." "I dare not go before the king unless I'm invited," said Esther. "If the king should not hold out the golden scepter to me, I would be put to death. No, I can't go in before the king." Queen Esther replied, "Appoint 3 days of prayer, and then I will go in before the king and ask him to save God's people. If I perish, I perish." Esther and her maidens prayed in the queen's house. Mordecai and his friends prayed in his house. All through the land of Persia, God's people prayed. Mordecai kept on sending messages to Esther, saying, "Don't be afraid. God will God choose you to be a queen for just such a time as this. Carefully, Queen Esther made herself ready to go in before the king. She used her sweetest smelling perfumes and put on her prettiest royal robes. Then she said, and her maids said a last prayer. Slowly they walked down the long hall to the throne room of the king. The king heard someone coming. He said, "Who would dare to come before him uninvited? Take that person away." He was about to say when he saw that it was the lovely Queen Esther who had come to see him. The king smiled at her and held out the golden scepter. Esther came near and touched the scepter. "What is your request, Queen Esther?" asked the king. "It shall be given to you, even half of the kingdom." Esther invited the king to come to her house to a special dinner. At the dinner, she would ask the king to save God's people. And it came to pass that the king made a new law, and God's people were saved. Messengers of donkeys come on camels, others on horses, to still others on foot, raced through the land, spreading the glad news. God's people shouted for joy. Perhaps the happiest of all was Queen Esther. Once Hadassah, the orphan girl, then Esther, the shining star. Thank you for listening. Friends, you can see from this story that God's hand of providence and protection on behalf of his people is evident throughout the book of Esther. This is my story about the very brave Queen Esther.